Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
President Obama this morning announced a historic agreement with Iran after days of talks in Vienna with representatives from 5 other nations. Mr. Obama lauded it as, quote, a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. The deal restricts how much nuclear fuel Iran can have, which amounts to the country having to reduce its current stockpile by 98%. It also reduces by 2/3 how many centrifuges can remain operating. Secretary of State John Kerry, who led the negotiations, said Iran will not produce or acquire highly enriched uranium or plutonium for at least 15 years. The detail will now have to be ratified by the GOP-dominated Congress, which may prove to be an even bigger challenge for Obama than international negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to have greater sway over Congress than Obama, denounced the deal, saying, quote, today a terrorist nuclear superpower is born, and it will go down as one of the darkest days in world history. Both the U.S. and Israel have major stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Well, Bob, with all of this work that Kerry and Obama put into this deal, is it going to go to waste as soon as the deal hits the U.S. Congress for a vote?
Well, we know there's a segment of the Republican Party, heavily represented in Congress, that rejects anything Obama does. We know there's a wing of the Republican Party, heavily represented in Congress, that rejects any sane approach to politics in the Middle East. Put those two things together, and it doesn't spell for an easy road for this deal. You know, I think it's still not clear whether Congress is going to finally give in, but we should step back and remember that any progress in the Middle East, a place where progress is sorely needed, is going to require Iranian and U.S. Collaboration. And this is the first step toward that. We can't solve problems or even contribute to solving problems in places like Iraq and Syria if the Iranians aren't part of the deal. Maybe some people in Congress don't like that, but that's reality. And this nuclear deal is a first step toward acknowledging that reality.
Just days before the one-year anniversary of the violent chokehold death of Eric Garner by New York police officers in Staten Island, the Garner family has accepted a $5.9 million settlement. The settlement does not include the admission of liability by the city of New York. 43-year-old Garner died after Officer Daniel Pantaleo placed him in a chokehold, which Pantaleo denies was a chokehold despite appearing on a bystander's video to be doing exactly that. A grand jury refused to indict him. New York has shelled out millions of dollars over the years to compensate family members of unarmed African Americans that its officers have killed. Meanwhile, in Ferguson, Missouri, which was a flashpoint in the Black Lives Matter movement last year, police continue to face protests, this time because a 16-year-old boy was shot in the face and seriously injured. About half a dozen people were arrested yesterday when they blocked traffic. Well, Bob, $5.9 million sounds like a lot, but is it really enough to compensate for the violent killing of your loved one?
Well, of course, no amount of money compensates for this kind of crime. You know, everybody understands that using the courts to win financial settlements to pressure governments and corporations to do the right thing is not a perfect method, but it's part of this system. So these kind of judgments do put pressure on police departments, on cities, to try and improve training and deal with this endemic racism that moves through law enforcement. That combined with the pressure from the streets, the Black Lives Matter movement, the long-standing movements to hold police accountable. We have one here in Austin, Texas. There are these kind of movements everywhere. The hope is that the pressure, the financial pressure that can be brought to bear through these kind of cases and the movements from the grassroots can start to shift this policy. It's not much to lean on, but these trial verdicts are important.
And the Black Lives Matter movement, by the way, just celebrated its second anniversary. It was formed right after George Zimmerman was exonerated in the killing of Trayvon Martin. Finally, President Obama, in a single day, doubled the number of prisoners to whom he has granted clemency. Commuting the sentences of 46 convicts yesterday brings his total to 89 people, which is still far fewer than, say, President Johnson, who granted clemency to well over 200. The move was in response to an ongoing project project to reduce the number of people in federal prisons who are serving excessive time for nonviolent or drug-related offenses, particularly those people who, if they were sentenced today, would receive far less time. The Justice Department still has nearly 8,000 clemency petitions waiting to be processed, the result of a major initiative that it announced last year. In response to that initiative, advocacy organizations had launched the Clemency Project. They're disappointed by how few applications have actually been processed. Bob, how important is such an initiative, and can Obama keep his promise in the next year and a half to actually move through them significantly?
Well, to the people who've been released and their families, this is incredibly important, of course. The recognition through this project that there are another 8,000 is puts on the table the possibility of more. But we should also remember there's probably about, 80,000 or 800,000 people in jail and in prison who don't belong there, that the locking up nonviolent drug offenders, which was a clear policy, especially since the 1980s, has been an abject failure. It's a failure clearly on moral grounds. It's now obviously a failure on policing grounds. All of these things have to be kept on the table. You know, with Obama, a lot of these actions are better than you would expect from maybe a Republican president, but they're not adequate to address the problem. So we can celebrate for the individuals who are now released this particular victory and keep the pressure on for not only allowing a few people out, but really changing the policy on policing and prisons in this country.
Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Anali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.